Hey everyone. We're going to kick it off. Thanks for coming. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Yuggera and Turrbal people, and extend that to the sea country of the Great Barrier Reef, which encompasses, I think, over 70 Indigenous groups. And that's because we're talking about the Great Barrier Reef today. So I'd like to extend that acknowledgement. But today we have John Day here, who's going to talk to us about a place that's really near and dear to a lot of our hearts, the Great Barrier Reef, especially because many of us travel to Heron Island, to our facilities there frequently. Super awesome place. So John is retired, affiliated with the James Cook University, but he comes from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. He spent nearly 3 decades there in a whole range of management and directorship roles. But most notably, he was for several years, almost 2 decades, one of the directors, and he led a whole lot of projects to do with climate change, world heritage, zoning, you name it. But really what's notable about what he did is he was very involved with John Tanzer here in the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park back in the early 2000s. And that rezoning process was pretty it's on the forefront at the time of setting aside areas for conservation. And back then, so they set aside about 30% of the reef in a representative fashion for no-take fishing zones. And the whole world is still scrambling to do that in the rest of, in their countries, despite there being international conventions putting pressure on countries to do this. So they were at the cutting edge, I guess, and John led that process. So we're very lucky to have him here today. I met John over 20 years ago when I was a graduate student at the University of California, and he was flown all the way from Townsville to give a talk to the school that I was in at the time. And it was really formative in shaping my career. And so when I saw the call from the School of the Environment to invite speakers, I thought, let's get John here. So please welcome John to give our seminar today.
Hopefully this mic's on. Thank you, Carissa. And thank you to the School of Environment for hosting me here today. I appreciate all the people who are here. Just make sure I can work this technology. Like Carissa, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and their elders past and present. But like Carissa also, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the area we call today the Great Barrier Reef, because that's what my talk is about. I'm going to come to this as a resource manager and a planner. I don't call myself a scientist, but I'm going to talk today about what I think are some good, bad, and ugly issues. But before I get into those, I just want to sort of raise some points about how I've perhaps looked at them. I won't have time to go through everything that's good or bad or ugly, so I'm going to choose a couple of examples and spend time on that. The examples I've chosen are not the sort of perhaps some of the obvious ones. So when I get to my list of ugly, you'll be hopefully very pleased to see that climate change is right on the top. But I'm not going to spend time talking about climate change because hopefully you guys know a lot about it. And secondly, I'm not an expert in that area. There's probably in the room lots of people who can do that much better than I can. So I want to talk about aspects of these good, bad, and ugly that perhaps less known to some of you. I want to also stress that for every one of these issues, there's good and bad sides. So, there's two sides of the coin. And also many of these issues are very interrelated. So we can't look at these just in single isolation. Today, perhaps I am. But I also want to stress the issue of cumulative impacts. And so whilst we're talking about issues, single issues, many of these, as I said, are very much interrelated. And you'll also notice when I put up my list, they're not prioritised. I've just listed them in alphabetical order. So let's get into it. What do I think are good and bad and ugly? If we start off looking at some good aspects of the reef, I've listed here what I think are some of those. And many of them you'll know: complementary management, ecosystem approach, the levels of funding, outlook report, passionate and committed people, research and monitoring, sound legislation, and a zoning plan. Now, many of those are interrelated. I'm going to talk about these ones in detail, or a bit more detail. But before I do, I want to really stress that it's passionate and committed people who are the reason we've had the successes in the past, and hopefully the successes in the future. Many people in this room are passionate and committed. Many people online that I know are coming on board. That's what we need to get these successes. And so I want to acknowledge all the people who've done things in the past for the reef and all the people who in the future are going to do stuff for the reef. But let's get into my list. Sound legislative framework. I'm sure all of you have heard of the legislation, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act. It's very important. It was groundbreaking when they did it in 1975. Here we have a piece of legislation that talks about reasonable use and conservation. It talked about balancing those things. But perhaps you're not aware, if you look at the primary object, which I've got there on the screen, and I apologise, it's a bit small, the main object of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act is to provide for the long-term protection, conservation of the environment, biodiversity and heritage values of the Great Barrier Reef region. Now, if I put up this list, you can see in the middle column what the Great Barrier Reef region is. It's different from the Marine Park. So even though it's called the Marine Park Act, the main object and what the Act is about is the region. The difference is the 12 exclusion areas. Those are where the ports are, and they're actually really important when we're talking about long-term sustainability of the Great Barrier Reef. So I do want to stress, the Act is about the region. The Act also then goes on, and the second, I think, object is really important. The other objects of this Act are to do the following so far as consistent with the main object. And then it goes on to say allow ecologically sustainable use, B, encourage engagement, etc. C, meet obligations. These are really important, but that fact that we've got that prioritised list, I think, is overlooked by many. And certainly I think we need to bring that up when we're talking about environmental decision making. It's not just about sustainable use, it's doing it as long as that's consistent with protection and conservation. An element linked to the sound legislative framework is the complementary management approach. Again, most of you, we've got both Queensland and the federal government involved in managing the Great Barrier Reef. And the way that they do this is through a thing called the intergovernmental agreement. And effectively that means that all the waters from high water mark down through to low water mark, which are Queensland, and out to the outer edge can be managed in a complementary way. So when we put out a zoning map, you'll see there it's got both the federal and the state government moniker on it, and it's very much a complementary approach to managing all those waters in the Great Barrier Reef. So we effectively, the state of Queensland mirrored the zoning. That's a whole saga and story in itself, which we don't have time to talk about today, but it nearly derailed the zoning when we were producing it, that the Queensland walked away at one stage. But today we do have mirrored zoning, and it's really important for the Great Barrier Reef. The intergovernmental agreement also provides for things like joint permits, joint field management. So the picture there, you've got a Gabrumpa officer standing right next to a guy with a possum on his arm. That's the joint field management approach, and joint funding. Moving on, the zoning plan is what we call subordinate legislation. So it's still part of the legislative framework, but as Carissa said, this is something we're really proud of, and we should be, Australia should be really proud of what we did with the zoning plan. So that's the zoning that you see today, and many of you probably know that, but perhaps what you don't recognise is that when the Act came in 1975, there was no zoning. All the Act did was set aside that outer boundary of the Great Barrier Reef region. And then over time, we started zoning. So the very first zoning plan was that tiny little triangle called the Cap Bunker down in 1981. Then over time, we moved to other areas. The Cairns section was the second, then Far Northern, then Central, and then finally Mackay Cap. So it was effectively 13 years after the time the Act came into effect in 1975 before we had the entire area zoned. Oh, sorry, I've just jumped back. Then after that, we moved to doing a rezoning of a couple of places. So we rezoned Cairns and we rezoned Far Northern. But it was at that point that we recognised we weren't actually doing what the Act required. We weren't protecting the biodiversity of the reef. We had zoning, we were really focused on coral reefs, but then we recognised the ecosystem was far more than just coral reefs. But I want to stress that was the zoning basically after going right through the park, and it sort of looked like that. And when you compare that to what we've got today, you can see, or perhaps you can't, at the back of the room, green zones, no-take zones made up only 5% of the total area. Again, focused on reefs because we thought they were the most important. So having gone through the rezoning, the 5-year process of going from the old zoning plan to the new, you can compare those two maps and see the changes. See how we produced a very systematic approach. Those green zones on the right in the new network, that was based on things like the bioregions, which some people in this room and others helped us develop. Things like the systematic planning that we had. This is very touchy. I want to just stress, though, that whilst we had sound science behind it, we could have had perfect science and not got the outcome. Sound science was really important to convince the minister to go ahead, but things like public engagement were also incredibly important for getting the outcome. So in this top left-hand corner, you can see the zoning map for the cap bunker, that little triangle I showed you, when it was done back in the early 80s. These are the sort of progressions we went through in developing the new zoning plan. So the map on the lower left was the draft plan in 2003. In the middle, you can see some of the public comments that came in about that cap bunker area. And on the right, you can see the final zoning plan that was actually approved by Parliament. So if you compare the final zoning plan on the right with what we came from the old plan, that's due to a whole lot of things, including the 31,000 public submissions received and analysed, the extra data we got during the process. So it really was bringing on board, as I said, public views and trying to meet those public expectations, but still meet our planning principles. In generating the zoning plan, I think there were some really important things done that perhaps people aren't aware of. If we look at the zoning boundaries today, they're very specific. But in the old zoning plans, we defined zones by distances from the reef edge. Back in those days, it looked pretty good on a map. 500 metres from the edge of Davies Reef was the edge of the yellow zone there. The edge of a front reef might be easy to find, but the back reef was impossible. And judging 500 metres over the water was also virtually impossible. So whilst it looked okay on a map, it really wasn't useful for users on the water and certainly useless for compliance. So we moved towards coordinate-based mapping in the new zoning plan. And you can see just straight lines to clear lat-long boundaries. Each of those coordinates needed to be carefully specified in degrees and minutes. And we actually did it to 3 decimal places. This is what's required to get effective compliance. So when you think about it, every one of those zones, every coordinate has a very detailed boundary description. And in the zoning plan today, you pick it up, 150 pages are these really detailed zoning area descriptions. Mostly you don't have to need to know it, but the point I really want to get across is that this was an enormous effort to generate. We couldn't come up with the final boundary descriptions till we had the final plan, and that was at 5 minutes to midnight before it went into Parliament. So the guys who generated this information, huge amount of work, a lot of effort, and every one of those points had to be checked. It was generated and then had to be checked to make sure, because you can't afford to have a mistake in something as important as a zone location if you're then going to try and take it to court. Equally impressive was the legal transition from one zoning plan to the other. Again, perhaps it's not clear, but when you have an old zoning plan with old zone names and you move to a new zoning plan with new zone names or new provisions, there are many changes required. And I'll talk more about things like TUMRAs, which are traditional use of marine resource agreements, special management areas. These were some of the regulatory changes that came into effect. They all had to be in law, and we had to do it instantaneously when the new plan came in. So to ensure things like permits, all the existing permits had to be then transitioned across. We couldn't afford to have a time when the old permit was not in effect when it moved to the new zoning plan. So there's a lot of legal complexities behind just generating a new zoning plan. Again, the staff of the agency worked incredibly hard to make sure these things worked, in conjunction, I should say, with others in, say, Commonwealth Drafting Office. If we move on, talking about the benefits, many of you are aware of this. The spillover is now something we can prove. When we first did it, the fishermen said, what's the benefits? Today, we can show things like bigger fish, having more babies, and then the connectivity that carries those from the green zones into the adjacent areas where they're caught. So effectively what we have done through the zoning is provided insurance for the future of GBR fisheries. So the key outcomes of the zoning plan is something I think we should all be really proud of. We came up with a single amalgamated plan for the entire area. The zone names were much better. In the old days, we had things like General Use A and General Use B. It was really confusing. The coordinate-based zoning, which I mentioned, greater protection, so going from 5% green zones to 33%. The new regulatory provisions, which are really important. The connectivity benefits I just mentioned about the spillover, and the fact that Queensland came on board and now has a single coast marine park for the entire complementary areas. Let's talk about some of the bad aspects, and unfortunately the list is quite long again. And things like backsliding, and I'll talk about that one, boundary complexities, compliance, Indigenous involvement, which I believe is largely tokenistic. We're not effectively using some of the existing management plans in our toolkit, like the special management areas, shipping impacts, water quality, and unsustainable fishing. The ones I'm going to talk about are those four. When I talk about backsliding, and I'll give you an example of what I think is unfortunate where we're going. In 1994, there was a 25-year strategic plan generated for the Great Barrier Reef. It was done with a lot of stakeholders, a huge amount of effort, and it had a really effective, in my view, 25-year vision. It talked about things like a healthy environment, sustainable multiple use, and it actually defined these things: maintenance of values, integrated management, knowledge-based but cautious decision-making, and an informed, involved, committed community. A really effective, in my view, vision that people could understand. Unfortunately, that sort of vision doesn't exist anymore. If we jump to the 2050 plan that exists today, that the government is promoting as their new vision for the reef for 2050, the vision in the 2050 plan says, in 2050, the Great Barrier Reef is sustained as a living, natural and cultural wonder of the world. My view is that's a really bad vision. Sustaining what is already currently degraded is not what we should be doing. We all know the Great Barrier Reef is poor. The government's own assessment says very poor, and it's declining. So this idea of shifting baselines we're really facing in the Great Barrier Reef, and we shouldn't be sustaining a living, natural and cultural wonder of the world when it's actually degraded from where it should be. So I think this is one example of backsliding. I mentioned boundary complexities. Again, if we look at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, it's actually a really complex boundary. In law, the first bit says along the coastline at low water. Now, low water, again, is a really bad definition, and the Queensland and the feds can't even agree on what low water means. But it's also in the Act got these specific exceptions. It says the majority of the islands are Queensland, so only 70 of the islands are regarded as Commonwealth Islands. So all the remaining 950 islands in the Great Barrier Reef are actually part of Queensland, so they're not part of the marine park. And they're surrounding tidal waters. So again, high water or low water around all those islands are donut holes in the Commonwealth Marine Park. Same with declared port limits. They are not part of the marine park. And same with what we call internal waters. So narrow strips of water between, say, here, Curtis Island or Hinchley Channel, they're regarded as internal waters of Queensland. Again, not part of the Commonwealth Marine Park. So the Commonwealth Marine Park boundary is actually quite complex. It's shown in that red line there. And a lot of people don't understand that. But luckily, we've got complementary management, as I said before. However, Queensland view is that their zoning goes out to 3 nautical miles. This is how states around Australia consider their state jurisdiction. Queensland, different view about where, and it doesn't matter that we have a different view. The Commonwealth, when I say we, the Commonwealth view is low water. That was as a result of a High Court decision. But with complementary management, it doesn't matter that we've got this differing view and the fact that there's overlap. So we've got a marine park that's 344,000 square kilometres, bigger than many countries, about the size of Italy and Japan. We've got a region which is slightly bigger because it includes the ports. And then we've got a thing called the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. The Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area, when it was set up, used the same boundary to start with along the coast at low water, but they didn't take any of the exclusions. So the World Heritage Area includes all the ports. It includes internal waters of Queensland and includes the islands, all the islands outside, or sorry, seaward of that boundary. So the World Heritage Boundary goes along the coast at low water. Low water, again, not a good boundary, but that's what we're stuck with. And then we've got on top of that, as I said, a single Queensland zoning plan from high to low water. So the complexities of boundaries are huge, but again, I stress this point, complementary management allows us to get around it. I want to talk quickly about Indigenous involvement, which I unfortunately think is largely tokenistic. When we first started developing the zoning plan, there was this move and we brought in TUMRAs, Traditional Use Marine Resource Agreements, which I think are a really positive step forward. The first one came into effect in 2005 for a place called Girrigan, or a group of traditional owner sea country groups in the central part. And that very first TUMRA was aspirational and it was fantastic and there was a lot of fanfare when we did it, and it then led to other TUMRAs. But in all honesty, I don't think we've gone as far with TUMRAs as we could or should. Gabrumpa has a stated aim of establishing effective and meaningful partnerships with traditional owners. Sorry, it's jumping around. Anyway, the effective and meaningful partnership is where I think Gabrumpa does a lot of things like Indigenous compliance training, which is fantastic, but they aren't giving those trained all those rangers the same powers as the other. And that's difficult, it's complex, but the Indigenous groups don't feel they've got the co-management that they were hoping under the TUMRA approach. The other thing that's happening in Gabrumpa is in the early days, we had a group called the Indigenous Partnership Liaison Group, specifically set up for liaison with, as Carissa said, the 70 TO groups. That partnership group no longer exists. Gabrumpa have decided to, sorry, it's jumping around. Gabrumpa have decided to have Indigenous partnerships spread across, and they've put the Indigenous staff into different groups. It's not nearly as effective when we had them together in one liaison group. Unfortunately, also a lot of the better Indigenous knowledge, staff with good Indigenous knowledge have now left. And it's interesting today that the Great Barrier Reef Foundation is spending probably more money on Indigenous engagement than the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority or the Reef Authority. So I think if the managing agencies are serious about establishing this effective and meaningful partnership, we've got to take TUMRAs further than where we're going, and we've got to do it more with other TO groups that aren't yet under the TUMRA. It's easy to say, hard to do, but I think we need to do a lot more. Okay, I want to talk about shipping impacts. Shipping, I think, is one of these things that's perhaps, it's not there in the Outlook report as a threat. In my view, there are lots of issues with shipping. Having said that, and this is the sort of good and bad, we've come a long way with shipping management. We now have a thing called the Northeast Shipping Management Plan, which requires mandatory pilotage. We have very strict vessel tracking using the VTMS. And again, if you haven't seen that, it's like a aircraft control area where they can see every ship on a big screen and they can monitor it. It's really effective. And we've got these things called designated shipping areas. You probably can't see it on the slide, but as well as the outer reef, outer designated shipping area, there's also an inner reef, very narrow one that comes down the coast here. And I'll talk more about that one in a minute. But we've come a long way with shipping management. There's no doubt about it. But I think the impacts of shipping are not well documented, and I think they're actually going to get worse. The projections are the sort of ships increase something like 200% in the next 20 years, particularly cruise ships. Cairns had, I think, 100 cruise ships in a year. Whitsundays is becoming a really popular area for cruise ships. And we've got increasing coal ships as well. As I said in the Outlook report, shipping is assessed as very good and the impact is low and stable. However, I would perhaps give a different perspective. If you look at some of the direct impacts and indirect impacts on shipping, it's actually quite concerning. I'll talk more about the Shengneng grounding in a minute, but there are huge impacts from ship groundings. But it's more than that. We've got things like both deliberate discharge and accidental discharge. I want to find out more, but my understanding from a colleague the other day is that ships are now trying to minimise their atmospheric emissions, and to do that, they're now putting a lot more stuff into the water. So there's a lot more sulphur going into the water because they don't want to be seen to be having emissions going into the atmosphere. that's the case, then we're potentially having huge impacts on inshore areas. We've also got damage on the seafloor from anchoring. On this little diagram here, on the bottom side here, this indication is every one of those green dots is a ship. So using AIS, that's a parking area of ships off the port of Mackay, one of the coal ports. So we've got very large numbers of ships in very small areas, just sitting there waiting, dragging their anchor, giving a big circle of anchor damage. And then as they head off, and that's an example of a ship starting up, moving, big propeller, and you get prop wash, doing that sort of thing. Effectively, we're seeing the same problem all the way down through the inner channel on a low tide. Larger ships with their prop are basically resuspending sediment all the way down through the inner channel. Just to finish off, the issues like vessel strikes, we're going to see more and more as the whale numbers increase and ships are going faster. We need to think about bringing in slow speed in certain areas. Slow speeds can reduce the noise pollution. So I think there's lots of shipping impacts that are not talked about in Outlook, and we need to start doing a lot more work on it. If anyone's looking for a PhD, I'd love them to think about the resuspension issue. I want to talk about channel widening because the associated port issues in another session. But before I do, let's talk about the Shengneng as a case study. Some of you remember Shengneng, a coal ship, Chinese coal ship that ran aground in 2010 off Gladstone. This image on the top right shows the 225-metre vessel sitting on the reef, coral, and that white plume is coral sediment, grind. The ship stayed on the reef for about 10 days, and the image in the bottom left, the black line is the AIS transponder on the boat, so it shows exactly where the boat was at different times, but the different colours show how long the ship was sitting there. The blue line is the indicative length of the ship. The red is when the ship was not moving on the reef. And then as you go into the orange colour, it was moving slowly, grinding its way across the reef. The greeny colour was moving quite fast. So it was on that reef for about 10 days and it had a huge impact, grinding its way across. And as it was grinding its way across, the TBT on the bottom of the vessel was being scraped onto the reef. The vessel was moved relatively quickly. And so from that point of view, I think, we did some good work. Unfortunately, it left huge scars on the reef and it left a lot of, as I said, TBT paint. And that's where I think we can learn a huge number of lessons. Unfortunately, because of a whole lot of circumstances, political, international problems, legal disputes, the fact that it was remote offshore, there were logistical delays, it took more than a decade to clean up that mess. Now, that is totally inappropriate in a World Heritage area. More than a decade to clean up TBT that was out there killing marine organisms. So I think the consequence of this, some of that paint wasn't there. The Marine Park Authority have gone in and said, we've cleaned up the shoal. They probably have cleaned up the shoal, but a lot of that paint has been spread far and wide because of the very strong tidal currents over that area. Okay, let's quickly, while we're talking about changes, I want to talk about a few other growths. This is recreational vessel registrations here in Queensland. 1972, 55,000, 2002, 270,000. That's the sort of pressures that the reef is facing, and that's a proxy for increasing fishing effort as well. Another indication is tourism. Now, this probably goes up and down with things like the current situation, but the blue line are domestic tourists, the green line, the orange line, international, the green is total. So again, huge numbers of growth in tourism. The way things are happening in certain parts of the world, I think that's just going to increase. So we've got to think about managing for the future. Let's finish off by talking about some ugly aspects. And again, quite a big list. And as I said, climate change right at the top. Remember, it's alphabetical, but I do think that climate change is the number one ugly aspect facing the reef. And climate change isn't just one issue, it's multiple issues, as you know. Cumulative impacts, loss of focus despite the dire outlook. The public are being duped, in my view. Reclamations, the structural adjustment for fisheries, and threatened species still under threat. The ones I want to talk about today are these four in the middle. Loss of focus, the public being duped, reclamations and structural adjustment. You may remember in my first good slide, I talked about the Outlook Report. I do think the Outlook Report is a really effective tool for showing change, monitoring, keeping the public and the politicians informed. So every 5 years now, by law, an Outlook Report comes out. And it's interesting, in the first two, the final prediction, or not prediction, assessment by the government was the outlook for the Great Barrier Reef was poor. Today, the last two, it's been very poor. That's pretty scary. That's why it's ugly. But more so is this sort of wording in the Outlook Report. Without additional local, national and global action, the outlook for the Great Barrier Reef ecosystem remains very poor, with continuing consequences for its heritage values also. The window of opportunity to improve the reef's long-term future is now. GBR must remain resilient and maintain its myriad of values. Society must play a pivotal and urgent role in mitigating impacts and adapting to change. I've highlighted that because that's where I think the public are being duped. I'll just also, while I've got that, that's the sort of wording that we see appearing in all sorts of plans. It's nice aspirational wording, but sometimes we're not following it up with action. But I mentioned this role of society playing a role. The society need to know what's actually happening out there to be able to play that role. The public are being kept comfortable because governments are very adept at saying nothing to worry about. It's all fine. You know, it's the best managed coral reef in the world. Don't you worry, we've got it in hand. Governments saying things like, we're building reef resilience by culling thousands of crowns of thorn starfish. Someone's laughing. COTS control. We are managing the threats to the Great Barrier Reef. We're not managing the threats to the Great Barrier Reef. We're doing a little bit of spending money, and I think wasting money over here on something that's not worth the effort that we're putting into it compared to some of the other issues. Spending hundreds of millions of dollars on reducing water quality. It's great that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Many other World Heritage properties would love to have that sort of money coming into their management. The reality is, though, when it comes to water quality, we're not achieving our targets. We're readjusting our targets because we're not getting to them. We've still got major water qualities. It's the second biggest threat facing the Great Barrier Reef, despite the hundreds of millions. And then comments like, you know, compliance is working because we conduct daily patrols. Again, it's great that we're doing daily patrols, but I think the compliance is far from being as effective as it could or should be, again, given the resources that go into it. The public is also, in my view, being duped because the government's very good at putting out lots of reports, glossy, fancy, voluminous reports that talk about all the things we're going to do together, but sadly, not about effective management. And we are seeing this shifting baseline. The Reef 2050 plan, which is meant to be the guiding light for the future, it's very aspirational, a lot of hollow rhetoric. I've mentioned before that vision, which I think is pretty well useless. The Reef 2050 plan is not giving us the blueprint we need to move effectively forward. We're seeing new strategies continually being released. We're about to see another one coming out on water quality. But the word on the street is that it's a good strategy, but it doesn't have the teeth. It doesn't have anything to do with implementation. It doesn't talk about the level of resources and when and things like that. So it's high level, it's a strategy, but we need those other documents to accompany it. And we're certainly not monitoring the effectiveness of these major plans. So what these things talk about, it's a collective responsibility, which is great, but that means no one is really responsible at the end of the day. In the old days, Kabrumpa was the lead agency. Today, everyone's responsible. The other thing that happens is that the World Heritage Committee, which sits in the UNESCO, is obviously very interested in the reef. You're probably aware that they've got a bit of a spotlight on us and have for the last probably decade. Is the World Heritage area in danger? The government's very good at swamping the World Heritage Committee with, again, all these numerous, voluminous documents. UNESCO hasn't got the resources to do a good job of reading them, so they just get all this stuff and the government says, it's all in there. We've told you everything that's happening and what we're doing, and it's great. UNESCO can only deal with what they know. They also need to be told by a state party what's happening. And there's a thing called the operational guidelines for all World Heritage properties that they're meant to adhere to. And one of the things in the operational guidelines is talking about boundary modification. If we jump quickly to the UNESCO website, there's a map on there on the right-hand side, which you can zoom in. It's very small scale on the original website, but you can literally zoom in and it shows you the boundary of the World Heritage Area as was declared along the coast of Queensland in 1981. And if we look today, this is some examples. The red overlay, as I said, is the boundary of the World Heritage Area. What Australian government and various ports along the coast have been doing is reclaiming areas out into the World Heritage Area, changing the boundary. Well, we've never told UNESCO. There's some people who say, oh, it's only a small change, doesn't really matter. You know, when we've got 344,000 square kilometres, 8 or 10 square kilometres isn't big. That's not the point. Is it having an adverse impact on values? I believe it is. Things like seagrass and therefore flow on. We need to be following due process and telling UNESCO. The Australian government is well aware of this and they've never formally told UNESCO. So we've got places in Gladstone, places in Airlie Beach. The one close to my heart is Townsville. On the right-hand image, you can see the current port limits today. On the left-hand image under the red, you can see where the World Heritage Area was and how we're just continually reclaiming areas out into the World Heritage Area. This isn't just one-off. The sort of square-shaped thing in the top corner was only done about 2 years ago. And in Townsville's own long-term plan, they're already proposing to go out further. This is their long-term plan on the right-hand side. You can see where that is in the World Heritage Area. This is death by 1,000 cuts. This is slowly eating into the World Heritage Area. An Australian government gives approval, ports go ahead and do it. UNESCO is aware of it because they've never been formally told by Australia they're doing nothing about it. I think it's a pretty ugly situation. The other thing, talking about ports, that was capital dredge spoil. So they build a reclaim and they put capital spoil behind it and they say, we're not dumping in the marine park. The other other issue with ports is what we call maintenance dredging and dumping. That's required for every port along the coast and things that aren't even official ports. But again, it's allowed under permit with conditions. But what they say is you dump in a designated dumping area. But what's really clear, when you can see that on the satellite imagery, is how the stuff doesn't stay in the dump area. Here's the official dump site. It's carried by wind and waves around here, right around Magnetic Island. This is a huge issue in 2006 when Hay Point had a massive dredging issue. Their stuff was carried literally kilometres up the coast. The Port of Townsville says we can't move from here because it costs us too much. What I don't think they're looking effectively is the cost on places like Magnetic Island and on the species in Cleveland Bay. That's just an image of one of those plumes from the dredging in 2025, moving towards the fringing reefs on Magnetic Island. Again, government's aware of it, ports aware of it, not a problem. Okay, I want to finish off with my list of ugly, talking about structural adjustment. This isn't my area, and I've got John Tanzer here to answer all your questions, but this, I think, is another example of ugly in the Great Barrier Reef. When we did the zoning, the best estimates of the impact on the areas that were going to be prohibited to fishing was in the order of 13 million of annual GVP. At the very last moment, the government decided to roll out what they called a structural adjustment package to assist fishers and processors or anyone who'd been adversely affected. They could apply for this money. There was various ways they could do it. It wasn't well handled, let's put that bluntly. It was basically seen by one of the government ministers as an open checkbook. Anyone who felt they were aggrieved came along and said, I need some money, and they were. Instead of reducing effort, which we should have done, the money that the fishers got was used to expand, to re-equip their vessels, build bigger vessels. So we actually got an increase in fishing effort instead of a decrease. And we also gave money to some fishers who didn't even fish in the Great Barrier Reef. So it was really not well handled. It's a bit of a debacle. And if you're really interested, there's a great paper by a guy called McIntosh who wrote, and here's his summary, the 250 million that was paid out for the SAP was an enormous and disproportionate sum to mitigate the impacts. So something worth about 13 million per annum, we paid out 250. Even if we'd done 5 years of payout, 80 million, 90 million, that sort of thing, that would have been perhaps appropriate. But 250 million of taxpayers' money basically given to fishers to continue to fish in the Great Barrier Reef. Really bad example of how it was done or shouldn't be done. The fishers themselves acknowledged they went all out of their way to embarrass the government. They kept putting their hand out. And so they were really keen that this never happen again. Well, as a result, there's much more strict rules on how structural adjustment does with future fisheries changes. But the damage was already done here in Australia, but also around the world. John was involved in WWF Oceans looking at MPAs around the world, and many countries said, we've just seen what Australia's done with their rezoning. Fantastic, you've done it, but there's no way we can afford that sort of amount. So this had global implications for other countries thinking about bringing in MPAs and what it might mean for fisheries. So what's the future of the Great Barrier Reef? It's under unprecedented pressure, natural and man-made. And as I said, I think the biggest threat is not the single issue, it's the cumulative impact of all these things together. Those pressures are going to increase, so perhaps our kids and other generations are going to see a reef like that, or not even that. So Gabrumpa still exists as an agency. It's quite different from when John and I worked there, but they need to prioritise what resources they have to actually look at and act on the main pressures, not on things like crown of thorns. There's still a possibility the Great Barrier Reef will be listed in danger by the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. I would argue that in danger is not going to fix the problem, so it's going to bring in lots more awareness, but we need to work on the problem if we've really got concerns. So what can be done? What can we do? What can everyone do? Recognising the people in the room, I think we need to think there are lots of good things happening, but equally there's lots of bad things that need to improve. And to sort of finish up, I've brought in some quotes from various people that I think might be relevant, particularly to this room. This person said, I used to think top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top problems are selfishness, greed and apathy, and to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, as we and scientists and lawyers don't know how to do that. That was a guy called James Speth in the US. Another of our colleagues, Rob Salm, said, as scientists, we need to remember that conservation is 98% politics, 1% science and 1% good luck. That means the 1% science has to be solid and beyond reproach, but we scientists need to devote a lot more time to understanding the role of politics. That would be something I'd really recommend that you guys think about. And here's another nice quote. Politics helps determine the direction to step. Science helps the eyes to focus. One last quote. Again, I think we need to recognise MPAs should not be undersold, but nor should they be oversold either. They cannot be the only solution to all the problems of the oceans. The problems of the ocean are going to be fixed, as I said, by passionate and committed people. So again, back to you, particularly the young ones in the audience. That's the challenge. We all have to work together. There is hope, but it's going to need a lot of work and a lot of help. Thank you.